The other picture that's noteworthy there, that's me as a tour guide. So I also do that on the side. So I think I'm very attuned to geographies of memory and contested places. And that kind of plays a large role in how I think about my research and research around recovery from disasters in general. I'm very interested in these cases where there's tension between the drive to recover quickly, expediently, and the drive to reduce risk at the same time, because often those are in conflict in that long-term recovery period. So that's where most of my study tends to focus. So about the wildfire problem specifically. Scenes like this are becoming more and more common, not only within the US, but across the world. You know, you just can look across, Turkey and Greece and Australia, and I believe Chile had some fires too, not long ago. So this is really becoming a common scene.
Actively having fires.
Yes. This is not just unique to the American West, but it is very pronounced and new to communities in the American West. Losses from natural hazard events are growing. We know this. This is kind of old news. This is the billion-dollar disaster graphic. But a lot of times measurements like this kind of hide the scope of the wildfire problem. You'll notice wildfire is in orange in this graphic, and we start to see regular wildfire losses hitting over $1 billion in the 90s and then into the 2000s. But because the way NOAA counts wildfire events, it tends to amass them together rather than looking at the community scale, at what's going on. And more these wildfires are destructive. They're destroying whole communities as opposed to just a few homes or structures in the outlying areas. So that's the big difference. And it's no wonder why we really haven't seen a lot of integration between kind of all hazards research, I would say, and wildfire. Wildfire is kind of an interesting silo of folks that work in that arena. And there has not been a lot of research going back historically in the natural hazards community on wildfire. And I think it has a lot to do with this graphic. So this is from Shameless, the Spatial Hazards and Event Losses database for the US. And you can kind of see three things going on here. So we've got deaths and injuries plotted on the X and Y axes. So you can see kind of the tally of human losses. And as you go from the lower left-hand corner to the upper right-hand corner, more casualties on the human side. And then we have the proportional circles on top of that. So that's kind of like your Z dimension here. So compared to hurricanes, thunderstorms, and flood losses, wildfire losses are relatively small. But the fact that since 2015, we've seen this growth of mega fires and fires that have destroyed whole communities, it's a new hazard, it's a growing hazard, it's one that will continue to gain prominence, especially as we see the impacts of human-induced climate change continue over the next several decades. This is another way to look at it, and this is also Shameless data. You can see, the trend line ticking up. This is the annual number of loss causing US wildfires going back from 1960 to about 2017. Sorry, I didn't update to 2020. But you can see the trend line, right? We see kind of a leveling up in the late 90s, early aughts, and then another leveling up in the 2010s in terms of the number of loss causing wildfires. And really, this is due to three conditions kind of coming together. It's the confluence of fire suppression and that legacy that goes back to the early 1900s in the West. Increased WUI development in the US is what we're seeing. And of course, you bring more people into this WUI, this wildland-urban interface environment, you get more ignitions, not only from arson, but from power lines, from equipment failures. And you have more people and stuff in harm's way, so heightened exposure. And of course, all this is going on at a time of extreme and chronic drought in the American West. High wind events are becoming more common. And of course, all of this is magnified by the changing climate, drying out fuels. So there is an open question here. Could recovery be a hot moment? We love our puns in the wildfire world. Could it be a hot moment for creating fire-adapted communities? We know that fire is often beneficial to some extent on the landscape within its natural fire regime in terms of frequency and severity. We have to live with fire. It's going to be part of our future, but are we doing that with our recovery? Are we actually recovering in a way that enables us to adapt to these changing conditions, or are we just recreating vulnerability all over again? So, I mean, yes, this model is kind of new, but it's very much informed by, the Blakey and Wisner school of thought in ways, looking at how each disaster event sets the stage for vulnerability to the next event. You can see the influences of, Susan Cutter and her kind of view of vulnerability as that combination of social and ecological exposure and sensitivity. And that is of people, of the built infrastructure, of the natural environment. So really, I think it's useful to start to look at recovery not necessarily as a period of achieving normalcy or returning to previous conditions, but really recovery as reshaping vulnerability for the next event, be it a wildfire or something else. So what I want to talk to you about today are two of the projects that kind of go hand in hand here. So the first is kind of a bird's eye view context into the policy and practice background of what's going on in California and what's going on in 3 specific counties that we selected as a research team that kind of run the rural to urban gamut, vary in terms of their social vulnerability, age, ethnicity, racial demographics, income. And then also these 3 counties that we chose in California have differing levels of impacts and etiology. So we have a mixture of fires that were human-induced and lightning caused, which would not be human-induced. California was chosen for a reason because they have some of the best developed policy in relation to wildfire anywhere in the US. So we wanted to see what was going on there. And we primarily use semi-structured interviews to get an idea here. This particular project we wanted to launch during COVID, and we had high hopes of traveling out to these communities and interviewing stakeholders on the ground. And of course, that had to be transformed into Zoom interviews at the end of the day. The second project that builds upon the first is one about housing recovery decision-making. So really looking at it from an embedded standpoint. What is the perspective of residents, homeowners specifically, whose homes were badly damaged or destroyed in recent wildfires? And we use a place attachment framework to understand residents' decisions, tough decisions and trade-offs in that moment. And we use the photo voice method to do that. So let's talk about the policy first. So the guiding question for this first pilot study or contextual study was where do we see tension between recovery goals and mitigation goals, both in policy and practice and between the state and local levels? So here are our study areas. I mentioned we went to 3 counties in California. These are 3 counties that have had a lot of wildfires since 2015. The Valley Fire was kind of the first large conflagration in Lake County, where almost 2/3 of the land area in the county has burned within the last 7 years. In addition to over a dozen wildfires, there were a couple floods and landslide events. So this county has been in a state of crisis for quite a while. We also have Butte County, which is the site of the Camp Fire, which has received a lot of press worldwide. For the town of Paradise, the whole community literally being wiped out there, the center of a thriving community. About 1/3 of that county has burned, and then 1/4 of Sonoma County. Sonoma is, of course, wine country, and this was notable for the Tubbs Fire back in 2017, which was the fire that burned over the mountain, down the hill, and then even outside of the wildland-urban interface. So a significant portion of the urban infrastructure that was not considered WUI actually burned as a result of that event. And then once again, you can see very different in terms of income and the percentage of housing that is actually in the WUI. We conducted 29 semi-structured interviews over the course of about 15 months and did some inductive analysis. There were 37 participants. This is the breakdown. So we started with these university extension folks who have they have expertise at the state level, and then they also are embedded within the local community. So they were great people to snowball from, both up to state offices and federal officials who were involved in the recovery and mitigation efforts, as well as snowballing down into communities to find informal leaders, so nonprofit leaders, community leaders, that also had some perspectives on the policy and practice. So I want to present a few cross-cutting themes across these counties, and then kind of a couple findings that were unique to each of the three counties. So not surprisingly, housing was a much discussed component of the recovery and mitigation efforts that were ongoing. A lot of discussion of the availability and affordability of of housing in general and the materials to rebuild. Of course, a lot of these recoveries were constrained by supply chain issues during COVID as well. So we heard a little bit about that. What we heard most, though, were really how locals and state level officials were trying to juggle competing priorities. So you had affordable housing requirements, what are called regional housing needs assessments, where each planning region within the state of California is charged with creating so many affordable housing units and so many units at various rental rates. So the drive to meet those targets was running against other targets like greenhouse gas limits and restrictions on the retrofits and the cost of those retrofits and rebuilds to WUI standards in those WUI areas. We also heard a bit about insurance coverage, and most of this took place when the moratorium on insurance cancellations was in effect. When we did go to California and conduct our interviews with residents, so the other project I'll talk about, we went this past month, we heard quite a bit about folks getting their insurance canceled. After housing, vegetation, not surprisingly, another major subject discussed across our areas. There is a growing acceptance of prescribed burning and cultural burning as well. Cultural burning being that indigenous practice that is gradually being reintroduced to this landscape after about 10 decades of not having that go on. Mechanical thinning, grazing are also being used, but there are big problems in scaling up any of these techniques to reduce fuels. And really these scaling issues are attributed to restrictions from the California Environmental Quality Act. So some of the environmental reviews that are cumbersome in order to get clearance to perform some of these controlled burns. We also heard a lot about fragmented ownership. Sometimes this was BLM land, so Bureau of Land Management, or other federal lands adjacent to private properties. Sometimes just the fragmented nature of the private property itself, or the fact that you had these paper lots that were subdivided and drawn on steep terrain with really no regard to access. So it made certain properties harder to access, and it was also harder to get adjacent landowners together, especially if there were a lot of part-timers, to say, hey, let's band together and go through the environmental review process together to do vegetation management. So that landscape level fuel treatments were a little tough to achieve. And then the other issue is decreasing windows of opportunity to even do these burns. When we went in January, smoke was coming up everywhere from the WUI, because this is the only time of year that the humidity is up, the moisture levels are up, and it's actually safe to do these kinds of projects. And then third, economic development. This was an interesting theme because it threaded differently through each of the counties. It was a little bit more contextual. So in Sonoma, really there's been a push to permit accessory dwelling units as affordable housing, since this is the easiest way to bring people back close to the properties that they lost and provide enough housing without having huge population displacement. But of course, there are some issues with providing adequate infrastructure, parking, those kinds of things. So trade-offs with the ADU solution. In Butte County, we heard a lot about chipping and defensible space. So there's talk of, can we get biomass energy in here? Because there's just so much fuel still on the ground. Even when you fell those trees, you've got to get rid of that timber somehow that's just lying there, and there's so much of it. So how can we make this economically profitable and sustainable over the long haul? And how can we use defensible space to really bring, we heard rec and tech was a buzzword in this recent visit. So how can we create an agritourism business that also creates buffer zones around our town? Finally, Lake County, really complicated little place. Lake County is kind of like the Appalachia of California is how I would describe it. You know, you have vegetation thinning going on and cannabis farming coming in. So cannabis farming is actually, some of the revenues are supporting the vegetation thinning. But because the county is 96% wildland urban interface, they're running into problems when it comes to introducing new housing development, which they see as the only way to grow economically in the future. In terms of county by county, when we asked about recovery goals, mitigation goals, we heard a lot about streamlined housing recovery in Sonoma County. So there was an emphasis on speed, on flexibility, getting people permitted efficiently, outsourcing the permit function to a contractor to allow it to happen faster and to upscale it really quickly. But the question is, as houses begin to return to this environment, which is still quite vulnerable, does it really facilitate mitigation in the end? Or does the permit process, speeding it up, actually inhibit mitigation? In Butte County, there was tension in the natural environment. There was this big preference for Ponderosa Pines. You can see some pictures here in the slide of what the area looked like before the campfire. So this is an area that I photographed in last year in September, unaffected by the campfire, but this was kind of what the area looked like beforehand. Very, very dangerous, thick woods. A lot of people are attached to that sense of place and being under the trees. And so how do we preserve that sense of place, of being in the woods, of being in a natural environment amid these new climatic realities where Ponderosa Pines, guess what? They're kind of a goner in a drier climate. We really should be adapting to oak woodlands if we want to have a more sustainable environment. And then Lake County, again, just very, very interesting here. There was such limited capacity on the part of local government, so much attrition going on in local government, a lack of trust in government, period. This county is so isolated and under-resourced that we actually saw this growth of hyper-local organizations, so like neighborhood-level organizations coming up, developing and taking responsibility, or trying to, for some of the mitigation efforts. So the question here is, how well can these hyper-local organizations and networks actually reduce the wildfire vulnerability that exists there? So some key tensions and takeaways from this first project. Well, we definitely have conflicts between what the state wants to see and how the locals feel like they have to implement it. We see environmental regulations that delay expedient recovery and mitigation. And we have finite resources. So there was a lot of competition in the jurisdictions between one county and the next for scarce resources. This was probably the most vexing piece, was the collective action piece, is that if you had one neighbor who kind of failed to do their job and mitigate properly, didn't matter if everybody else around them did what they were supposed to, the whole neighborhood ended up being impacted. So it seems like for wildfires, it's a little bit of a unique context. You know, with floods, you can elevate one house and it benefits, you know, that house, doesn't necessarily harm the neighbors. The cost of inaction actually does harm the neighbors in a wildfire case. So we have a collective action dilemma here. And I'm going to ask Emily if I'm running low on time for time cues, can you use your hands, because the chat is coming through on the screen I'm sharing.
So far, you're doing okay. I think we have built in some extra time, so I would say keep going. I can give you maybe a thumb, maybe a T. Oh, this.
Give me a 5 minute.
I will do that when it's like, okay, I will.
Awesome. So I want to move to the next portion of the study, which this is a little bit shorter since we're still kind of in the process of doing data collection here. And this involves post-fire housing decision making. So here we're kind of moving from that policymaker level down to the resident level and asking, you know, why after wildfire do residents choose to either A, replace their homes in the same way, in the same places before, B, rebuild and add mitigation features to that housing, or C, relocate elsewhere, either with or without making repairs. And we believe that place attachment is kind of this researched, underutilized framework that might help us to understand some of the dynamics that are going on here. The photographs you're seeing, by the way, on the left is from a town called Concow, where the campfire broke out. So you can really see that the fact that the forest, that dense Ponderosa pine forest, is no more. It truly has been decimated. And folks here in the rural areas are living in travel trailers 4 or 5 years later after the fire. So they're still very much, in the throes of recovery. And on the right, this is from Coffey Park in Sonoma County. And this was a middle income area that was destroyed by fire, not in the WUI. It has largely returned and come back. And we see this is a piece of fire art in a local park. So with place attachment, there are 5 different components that weigh into this idea of place attachment. We've got that shared understanding of place definition, the functional element of why you live where you live, the dependence piece. So is it close to your job? Do you have a livelihood that's landscape dependent? Schools and community services and that kind of thing. But place also forms a part of the notion of self. So how much of that is reflected in people's choices to return or relocate, or even in where they relocate? Bonding, those emotional ties, a love of that place you've spent a long time in. And collective efficacy, so that belief in shared goals and the capacity to achieve them together in the community that you're in or in the community that you locate to. So after an environmental disruption, the theory goes that we go through this interpretive process of kind of understanding the landscape once again, understanding how we fit into it, and that drives both the household and the community level response. And as far as households go, households can choose one of those 3 paths: relocate, rebuild and mitigate, or rebuild just the way it was and hope for the best in the future. We believe there might be some interplay here between social capital and place attachment. So I think that's an interesting angle here, that place attachment might end up predicting social capital. We'll see. So for this project, we're trying to reach 75 folks, ideally 25 from each of our study counties, although Lake County is more sparsely populated and it's been a little tougher to make inroads there. We've been using respondent-driven sampling. So getting back in contact with our stakeholders from the first project, the local stakeholders, saying, pass the word, we're looking for homeowners, and then having participants that we recruit snowball to other people they know who rebuilt or relocated. After the respondent-driven sampling, we've noticed that our median age is creeping up in our sample. We have a lot of retirees with time to do photo voice and not a lot of younger folks. So we're trying to target those younger groups now and also find relocatees and consider divided tenure situations. So situations in which folks may have owned a mobile home or travel trailer, but rented the land underneath to try and broaden our swath of socioeconomics really in the sample. The chart down below gives you a sense of where we are in the process. We have 49 people recruited. We've interviewed 26 of these people. In terms of interviewees we talked to, you can see, the sample definitely is a little bit on the older side, a little bit more on the affluent side. So we're trying to adjust that downward. We are definitely leaning towards white participants, but in talking to some of our local partners, a lot of the rural areas that were affected in these 3 counties, that might not be as far off as the county demographics suggest. So what is the photo voice method? Well, few steps. We have a training session with participants of about 20 to 30 minutes where we explain some instructions, and then we send them off to take photos, a maximum of 27, because we have a few people using disposable cameras. Most are opting to use their iPhones and cell phone cameras, but we ask them to take pictures around their house that tell the story of their recovery, and then take pictures around the neighborhood, community, and natural environment that show meaningful changes to them. Afterwards, we go and sit down for the interview. That's why I gave you the demographics for that. These are the folks who are complete. So after they sit down with us to talk about their photos, as you see here in the picture, we interview them for about 75 minutes and then they are complete. We'll be doing qualitative coding on this, and then hopefully within a year, returning for a community workshop in each of the counties to talk about our findings and really have a resident-driven discussion on how these findings can be further used for advocacy for ongoing needs. Since we have a lot of people relocated to other states, we're using Google Jamboard for those interviews and conducting them online. So this is kind of the setup. We play Battleship as we discuss their photos and go through the semi-structured interview guide. And so the preliminary findings from this, what's been interesting, I was in California about 3 weeks ago, the folks who rebuilt, there was little second guessing. So it seemed like all of them said, nope, there was the decision to rebuild. Once we made that decision, we went forward. No waffling with the permit process, in spite of that being a difficult experience. We saw a lot of adherence to the new building codes, which was heartening to see, especially in the upper income brackets. I mean, wildfire-proof housing nearly being rebuilt on the extreme end of that. There was some confusion between features that were really sustainability focused, like solar panels and energy efficiency, versus actual wildfire mitigation. So some interviewees tended to conflate those two. What we heard about rebuilding was kind of interesting too, in terms of the nature that a lot of the folks who decided to rebuild still were very attached to their natural environment, but now appreciated the views rather than the trees before. Nearly everybody said, I did it. I'm glad I did it. I would not do it again if I had to. So that in itself is interesting, in thinking about the potential for this to be a repeat hazard, a chronic hazard. And relocation, we just didn't sample as many of those yet. So there's a lot more variation in the rebuilding stories. We're not close to saturation there. But some interesting findings I think we'll see in terms of trauma. We definitely heard more trauma infused in those relocation stories. And also the idea of memory, in either replicating that previous natural environment around them or avoiding it altogether with their selection of location. We're doubling down on rural recruitment because the rural stories are actually very, very nuanced, much more affluent, much more nuanced than the urban stories. And then affluence also has a play in this in terms of how people relate to the natural environment. For example, in Sonoma, a lot of the people we interviewed in the hills around Sonoma were more affluent. There was this deep, deep environmental knowledge about these species of shrubs and caterpillars, versus in Butte Lake, it was more, oh, the pretty trees. That's why I live here. So there definitely were some differences there, and we think affluence plays a large role in some of the differences we're seeing in these stories. So, there's a lot of things left to do here with this project. I won't belabor that since we're reaching the end of time, but I will say, if you're interested in diving into this area, there is a lot of work to be done as we think of people-centric recovery and how we can use human nature to further reduce vulnerability and support risk reduction. If you're interested, here's the shameless plug for all of the publications that relate to things I've mentioned in this talk, both in terms of photo voice methods and then some of the wildfire work that's coming out in IJDRR and Journal of Extreme Events. And yeah, I'll stop there, and hopefully we have a couple minutes for questions.
Yes, thank you so much. I really enjoyed learning more about that. I know I have a couple of questions, but because I've already had the opportunity to talk a little bit today, does anyone have any questions? Yes, Richard, you're the first hand I see.
Yeah, I have a few questions, but I guess my main question is, for your data that you are using for wildfire, where are you getting the, I guess, the acres burned for these wildfires and the mega fires that you're primarily focusing on?
For the map that you saw, is that what you're asking?
Right.
Yeah, I think that was GeoMac. So we use MTBS is a good data source, and then GeoMac is the other data source.
I see. And because I've been using the fire center, the interagency fire center map, and they provide wildfires, acres burned, and I think one of the concerns we're having is they get reports from different areas. So what exactly pertains to one county versus another county? So if 100,000 acres, a mega fire happens in one place, is that the same report as another, somewhere in Kansas, or something that reported the same wildfire, but in their area? So we're just having the trouble of, are we double counting wildfires essentially?
So one thing I learned when getting into wildfire research, you may or may not know, is the names are not unique. So it's not like a hurricane name that's unique to the storm. Of course, those rotate every 6 years. The way wildfires are named are by location, usually a street name or a landmark near where the fire started. So you can have the Valley Fire in California. There are actually multiple Valley Fires if you look back in the NTBS database going way back. So if you use the fire name to join, it's not a good way, because you might actually have a lot of fires from discontiguous counties in different years that are totally different events. And then, the wildfire naming is troublesome too. I did some case study research that's the one that's forthcoming in Journal of Extreme Events on the 1998 Florida fires. And they're really, in the Eastern US, they don't adhere to that naming convention as strictly as in the Western US, where it's more common to have those kinds of events. So, trying to figure out which fire was in Brevard County, Volusia County, the MTBS was the only way to really get a shape file that had the boundaries, but you weren't able to pick out in news articles or press releases which fire was which. So we ended up referring to them collectively as the 1998 Florida fires, because there weren't names. So sometimes it's a matter of bad reporting and the conventions differing by region.
Yeah. So our wildfire area is the central plains, Kansas, Oklahoma, Texas, and we're noticing that the reporting is, it's not up to what we would want. In Oklahoma specifically, we have places where there's heavy reporting, and there's places where there's none. So it's a big area of data, no data, big area of data, big patches. So we were just, it's hard to do an accurate data analysis when there's so much data missing. And
yeah, you kind of have to do some back end remote sensing change detection work almost to kind of verify some of that. And I know Anu Kramer just had a paper out. I can't remember which journal. I'll try and find it and send it to you if you put your email address in. But it was about housing rebuilding in California going back from like 2000 to 2018, and they used remotely sensed data to look at the footprints of the houses that were coming back to see if they were larger or smaller, and which wildfires were having them come back and not. So they kind of found the jacuzzi effect, if you're familiar with that, the idea that after a wildfire, you have more affluent classes have this windfall because they have better knowledge of the insurance system, and you actually ended up seeing an increase in the building footprint overall in California in the rebuilt houses versus the houses that were there before.
Yeah, that's very interesting. Thank you very much.
Yeah,
thanks, Richard.
Richard, definitely drop your email in the chat, and we can also, Ronnie, if you have any resources that you think would be interesting, send it to us and we'll send it out to everybody, because I definitely know there's lots of interesting questions, and I agree that this is definitely under-resourced, under-researched. There's just less of a precedent for how to conduct this kind of research or how to organize that kind of data. So definitely
Absolutely.
interesting. Nell, I saw your hand up.
Hi, Dr. Schumann. So I am not I'm basically a volcanologist, but I guess in volcanology a relative problem is the spreading of misinformation. But I don't really know how much of a problem that is in wildfires, and how does it affect your work?
What kinds of misinformation specifically?
I guess that's what I'm asking, because I really just don't know if there is. It's a big problem with wildfires as it is with volcanic eruptions, hurricanes.
I see misinformation most often in terms of kind of expectations for recovery and expectations for agencies that provide assistance. I don't think that it's a recent phenomenon. But kind of over several decades, the expectation that FEMA will make you whole again has proven to be inaccurate. And that's something that I think survivors have a general understanding, like, oh yeah, FEMA is going to make us whole. And then there's this supreme disappointment when FEMA comes in to rebuild public infrastructure and actually does not make people whole. So there is a lot of misinformation out there on the degree to which you will receive assistance for your housing. You know, we live in the United States in this limited intervention kind of housing recovery policy environment where it's the onus of the homeowner to have insurance or have savings. And those are the two primary ways that, you know, one is to recover. So it totally discounts the social justice piece of it where, you know, the most vulnerable are the least able to recover. But yeah, it's a common misunderstanding that FEMA grants will make you whole. So that's where I hear it most often in this kind of scenario. Although I will say we did have one guy who, you know, we started doing our recruiting and he reached out to us and he said, oh man, you're in this for the wrong reason because these fires aren't naturally caused. This was, you know, a government conspiracy. So we did get a little conspiracy theory at the very beginning, but that was an outlier.
That's fair. That was very interesting insight. Thank you.
Yeah, I think he was attributing it to some kind of a laser or defense weapon that was tested and set off the campfire. So there's a bit of misinformation.
If only things were that organized.
Very fringe.
Yeah, very fringe. All right, Tay?
Hi, Dr. Schumann. Thank you so much for this. This is fabulous. This is an area which I'm more familiar with in the flood context. I study a lot of post-flood buyouts and decisions about how buyouts are undertaken versus going on the private market versus staying and rebuilding, whether or not mitigation procedures are undertaken or not. And so this is incredibly interesting to me. On the topic of misinformation, one thing that I encounter quite a bit is that there's this misunderstanding in terms of how one is continually at risk for flooding, which I imagine is something that resonates as well in wildfire, where people either substantially discount their own risk, whether or not they live on a floodplain or an area that's prone to wildfires. And so I was wondering how perception of future risk played into decisions of whether or not to relocate or rebuild, and if that also played into the decision to mitigate or not. And in addition, I also just wanted to know, because I see that your sample, as you noted, is fairly affluent, but I was wondering if you had spoken to anyone yet who was uninsured or underinsured and saw maybe if there were any differences in those decision making.
Yeah, no, those are really great questions. Thank you, Tay. So the short answer to your first question is yes. The future risk did definitely impact decision making on how to recover, you know, what people were doing. In one of the relocation cases, it was really interesting to see this person was so traumatized by the fire, she's moved to a new house and, you know, put every possible wildfire mitigation in place. They replaced their siding with hardy board. They have the generator. They have the sprinklers to spray the top of the house, in addition to, you know, the ones that are required by the fire code. Fire safe landscaping, you know, nothing within, you know, 10 feet of the house. So like they have gone gangbusters. But even then, you kind of hear the trauma. Like we kind of poked and prodded in that case, you know, about, well, would you continue to stay here? Do you think you'll live here for the long haul? And, you know, just kind of, you can hear how trauma still plays a role there. A lot of folks in the rural areas, they live there for a reason. They either want the isolation, or they want the natural environment, or they want them both. Sometimes the want of the natural environment is for amenity reasons among the affluent. More often it's because they're employed in forestry if they're from the lower socioeconomic you know, groups. So yeah, I think future risk does weigh in, but sometimes the place dependence or the place identity in a way weighs out. It proves more than the risk. But we definitely saw a lot of people, you're required if you rebuild in the WUI to meet Chapter 7A of the California Building Code. So by and large, the ones who rebuilt are better off than what they were, even if they had a modular home. Those standards are better than what they were, not quite as strict as stick-built homes. And then what was your other question that was so good?
whether or not you'd had the opportunity to speak to anybody who was uninsured or underinsured at this point, and sort of if there was a different risk calculus.
So not uninsured completely. I don't think we've interviewed anybody who is completely uninsured. And a lot of that has to do with the way that the mortgages work in the United States, right? You have to maintain hazards insurance on your property if you have a 30-year, 20-year mortgage that's federally backed. So it was very uncommon. Almost everybody had insurance, but we did speak to quite a few people who were underinsured versus what their replacement cost was. And this is really common in disasters, not just wildfires, for the replacement cost to far exceed the value of the structure. And folks are only insured up to the value of the structure. So yeah, that definitely played a role, but we need to get a little deeper into the data for me to give you a definitive answer on how.
Okay, Aditya, what is your question?
All right. Thank you, Dr. Schumann, for the talk. It was very interesting. I'm not too familiar with wildfires in the context you spoke of. I come from a geotechnical engineering background, so I talk more about wildfire-induced landslides, which you mentioned. But I'm really interested in like the role of indigenous knowledge in preventing natural disasters or mitigating them. So I'd be curious to get more information about the role of the cultural burning that you were talking about in your presentation. How does that work? Prevention.
So, so Native Americans who've been on that landscape for eons had a lot of knowledge about what keeping ladder fuels down, right? What it took to maintain a healthy forest ecosystem with very little ladder fuel, mature trees. So cultural burning was simply kind of what they did as prescribed burning, what we would call prescribed burning in kind of a Western or modern context. They did culturally as a communal activity, multiple times a year at points when the moisture levels were high. So it's a practice that, we have a different name for, but that was very much embedded in their cultural worldview and their community calendar each year. And what we're seeing is that, like in Lake County, I know some of the Tribal Eco Alliance, which is a really cool group. I posted a quote there. We interviewed someone affiliated with that, and I posted that quote because fire is speaking. It's telling us that we're out of balance. I mean, just like mind blown. It's like, yes, that's exactly what's going on right now. We are very out of balance. But in Lake County, they are actually doing some community events this May, I believe, to introduce tribal members, kind of have them lead some burning and kind of teach the wider community. So that education and that direction from indigenous knowledge to the wider community is actually starting to happen, which is exciting. And it needs to happen more. It's just that there's a lot of environmental regulations actually slowing down the ability of that to scale up quickly to meet the problem. So we've kind of backed ourselves into a corner in our bureaucratic solutions. So
thank you so much. Yep, that helps. Thank you.
We're hoping that our trip aligns with that week in May to get to go and be a part of that.
That'd be great.
Yeah, I was going to ask a very similar question actually about also your research is really heavily focused on kind of the conception of risk as well as like the actual physical risk or the actual kind of measurement of the hazard. And I think that's a really interesting intersection when talking about fire, because there's lots of ways in which fire itself is actually the solution to fire. And, issues with drought and more fire actually means that fewer things are taking the water. But my curiosity really is, have you spoken to people who are actually opposed to using prescribed burns in the future as a way to mitigate fire? Because I know watching a documentary about how people would when fires were actually approved, when prescribed burns were actually approved, people would report those fires and shut them down before they even struck a match because they heard it was going to happen and they were just opposed to, say, the smoke or there's intersecting risk from like air quality. It's complicated, but did you ever talk to people who were against using fire to help, even if that is one of the most effective ways to kind of manage fire risk in the future?
Not in this context. We really haven't spoken to anybody who's been totally opposed to that. I think you might run into that in areas where there were prescribed burns that have gotten out of control, that weren't as closely managed. But we didn't see any in this case. And interestingly enough, prescribed burning is something that came back first in the Great Plains and was then introduced to California. So California is not responsible for this resurgence in the popularity of that technique. That was actually something that came out of the plains. I saw Richard shaking his head, saying that he had heard of some of those cases of preventing this, but that's the origin.
Okay. Wow, that's really interesting. So we are actually out of time. Thank you so much, Dr. Schumann, for this presentation. I know it's definitely tickled a lot of our interest, I think.